Hey everybody. The theme of this little preparatory video is about how we look at light and space and atmosphere to some extent out in the landscape. So this is, if you like, an opportunity to be more even creative or inventive when you're out there in the landscape. But going back to basics, the light that we see and the light that we experience out there is what determines a lot of things, like how do we see distance, how far away a thing appears to be, or close it appears to be, how enclosed are we, how objects sit within space within each other, how do they relate to each other, and also what atmosphere, what emotional atmosphere we can create through that. And if you look at some of the great painters, Turner and all various people like that, who used a lot of atmospheric sort of color and tone in their work, they exaggerated that. They pushed further than what they probably even saw. So this is going to have an interesting project. But going back to the fundamentals of it, what I want to do is just reinforce, sorry for shaking the camera there, the idea that how does light change? When we look at something, what is it we see that makes the difference? And sometimes we don't really sit down or stand and look at that. And that's what I would like you to be doing when you do go out and look at landscape. What I'm going to do here, I'm just working around here to show you this, I hope. 3 or 4 pictures that I've taken with this in mind, and here's a scene which is quite open. We're looking out over a river towards trees in the distance. We're standing in amongst trees, and it's all primarily green. This is the interesting thing. There's not many other objects in it. There's some sort of a pipe there, but there's not many other objects in it that change the color. But you can see 2 very simple things, and it takes a wee bit of observation, I know, but if we look in the foreground and look at the difference in tone between the darkest shadows and the lightest bits of the leaves, so where light bits meet dark, there's quite a high contrast there. If you then take your eye way back here to the distant trees and look at the darkest you can see and the lightest that you can see, the difference is less. So contrast becomes less the further you tend to go away in most cases. So high contrast up front, lower contrast as we go back. Now, that's affected by other things, like that's affected by things like the weather. Of course, if it's misty, that will shroud a certain area and change the contrast that we appear to see as well. So it's not just one factor, there's a whole lot of things going on. But generally speaking, if you decrease the contrast, you're increasing the illusion of space. So if I can bring this back again, I hope you really see that there. And look at the next image. This is the same image in black and white, and hopefully you can see, if we focus down here again, down the center lower part, you can see the intensity of the blackness or darkness. It's black, and shoot back up here and look for the darkest. You can see it's harder to find what you would term a black or a very, very dark color compared to what's at the front. If we move on again, we'll change the atmosphere slightly. This one here, you may have seen this image. It's extremely high contrast. So the darkness of the trees is extremely intense against the lightness of the background. And immediately we create almost like a frame and a viewfinder in a way, because we peer through the gaps of light in the trees. And a lot of artists have used this method when they've been creating moody atmospheric scenes. If you go back to the 16th and 17th century, where people were telling various stories of myths and legends and things going on. And you would have these sort of scenes with great dark shadowy trees in them and people fighting or doing whatever they were doing. But on a practical level, again, look at the gaps in that again, and look at the contrast in the spaces we see in the distance through the tree. Look at that space. Don't worry about the color, but look at the fact that the colors are softer and they're also less highly contrasted. Whereas if you come down here, you have a very high contrast thing going on, this big area there. And of course here, these black and darkened trees, that of course has become because the light is behind them. And that's the difference. If you have a light behind you as the artist shining on the objects, they will be lit up. If the light is behind the objects and in front of you, as it were, this is what's happening. And that changes the atmosphere completely and the patterns and the interest, if you like. If we moved on one more time, another time I should say, here's a similar thing, but what's interesting here is you have those big dark trees with light shining from behind in the distance. But when we come to the foreground, we are standing here somewhere, the artist, and this is all lit up. This is all in light. Then it disappears back into shadows here. So this little area is a shadowy area, and then it hits another light area behind the trees. So there's the change, two changes nearly going on there. And as an artist, we might be standing there and we might want to decide, do we want to focus on this drama of the dark against light here, or are we more interested in something that's going on up here, this tree in this light area here? So we make selections about light and shade as we look at our subject. And just finally, I think there's an image similar to the first one. Actually, it's part of the first one, to be honest. It's the same image but chopped. And you'll see there that, as we pointed out, the difference in contrast as the objects go further away. Now, what I did was I trimmed a strip out of this from top to bottom, and I've turned it on its side. So I've cropped a little stripe, if you like, of that, and we'll see it now, and turned it on its side. You can see the image. And that, I think, helps us understand this light business more clearly, because here's the foreground on the left, the background, as it were, is on the right, and you can see almost like a color card in a DIY store. You know, you can see that generally speaking, the highest contrast of tone is here, the lower contrast here, but you will also notice that the colors in the greens especially are very rich yellow, warmer greens. Midsection here becomes slightly cooler, a bluer green, if you like. And then the third section here on the right becomes not only bluer, but grayer, desaturated. So there's the reinforcing of the rules of distance, if you like. Lower contrast, lower saturation as we go back, and usually lower color, lower temperature. So from warm to cold in most cases. That can be changed depending on the light conditions. So we don't want to set that in stone, but the general rule is, and I hope you can see that there, and hopefully that hopefully those little images get into our brains, what we want to be looking for when we're out in the landscape. So what I'm going to do is talk through some other bits, demonstrate one or two ways in which we can actually do that physically with our paints, and what atmosphere perhaps you want to create. You know, what do you want to exaggerate? So I would be encouraging you, you know, yes, observe what you see, but then later on in your sessions outdoor, you might begin to say, well, you know, I'm going to make it more so, and I'm going to create a picture that it almost tells a story, or you know, gives a mood to the viewer, and that's going to be quite an interesting challenge as well. So we'll move on now with more information. So just to illustrate what we're talking about in terms of distance and light and so on, this is just using greens, okay? Now obviously in the landscape, we might be concerned primarily with greens, but the truth is we may be painting a landscape that is browns or earth colors or greys. It might be a seascape. So the idea of greens is just here for illustration purposes. So if I take and make a green, which I'm going to do here, little yellow, little blue, we'll get that is lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, and we get a fairly strong, standard, fairly rich green. You know, it's about 50-50 or thereabouts. But if I was then to say, okay, let's put that in on this little piece of board here, and you can see as I'm putting it on, you know, that it is fairly rich, really, very strong color. So it's an exaggeration. You may not see greens quite like this in our landscape in Ireland, certainly, but let's say we have a strip there, and I'm going to do this as simple strips, okay? So I'm going to make a little bit more of that up so that we can do things with it, if you like. A wee bit more yellow and get it a mid-green there. So you can see there what I've got. I'm going to clean up my brush here. And we talked about the principle of things becoming cooler as we go back. So we'll cool it with blue, but we know, and if you've seen the other videos that I put out, that the blue is dark, the green's a bit lighter. So we want to add a little bit of white to the blue, bring it up a little bit before we add it in, okay? So we can see that we're adding a little bit more, actually. Let's make a wee bit more of that up and scoop that in to the green, and we stir it all together. You can see the difference happening there. So we have a cooler thing going on, and we also suggested that there be a certain amount of desaturation. So we desaturate green with its complementary. The complementary of green is red. You'll see that on your color wheel. Again, if I look at the red, it's very dark. So I want to scoop a little bit of white in there and bring that up a little bit. And then add it in, and you'll see how that is muddying up the green. And we put that on there. You can see the difference in that green and that very desaturated color. Okay. Now the other thing that may happen as objects go into the distance, they may become lighter. Not necessarily, obviously, because you can. Let's imagine these are hills here. I mean, this section that I'm painting at the moment is relatively dark, you know, but it is desaturated and grey and tends to fade back compared to the richness of that. But and this is where it comes down to observation, because what I'm doing here is talking about theory. You see what I'm doing is adding some white to that mixture that I've just made up. So it's a very, very pale colour. But why I'm doing this is because in reality, when you're out there, you will see whatever colours you're going to see. This is just a very idealistic sort of view of it. But you might be seeing greens, you might be seeing yellows, you might, whatever colour you're looking at. But if you want to know how to desaturate and change them, this is why I'm showing you this, that you add in small amounts of the complementary, make sure they're the same lightness, so keep it light. And you can see now this strip that's going on beside that or behind that, how much paler that is compared to that. So you can see that there is some sense of we're fading back, perhaps even more. And it can go into the point where it's nearly, you know, very, very, very subtle indeed. But those three strips, I hope, just illustrate something of the transition that happens when you cool down and desaturate a color. Now, you might have a color like brown. I'm just flipping this over, and hopefully maybe just flip that over just for the purpose of this exercise. Okay, but you might have a brown color, involved in the landscape or involved in what you're painting. So you may, and I'm just going to bring out a brown sort of color here. I'm going to bring out some burnt sienna. Hopefully you can see that. I'm squeezing that out beside the red there. So a quick way with the likes of brown. So obviously I'll put this brown on here. You can see I'm rubbing it in so you can see the lighter versions of it. Now, you may not be seeing this in the landscape, but just as a matter of interest, if you're seeing something of that nature, there might be in the way back in the distance objects that were brown or red. You might have a brick wall way back in the distance, and that may, if you were able to drive up and sit beside it, it might be that color right if you looked at it right beside it. But miles away in the distance, it obviously would also be drained out, desaturated, cooled down, all of those things. Now, here's the interesting thing with brown, especially reddish browns like this. The easiest thing to do is to add a little blue to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lighten it slightly, just so that it kind of brings up the brown as well, but it adds to this spatial thing. So there's a paler version there, and I'm going to scoop that, clean that brush again and scoop. I'm not using a palette knife just for this exercise. Tiny little bit of blue going in here, maybe another little bit there, you can see. And what I did, if you notice, I forgot to change the brightness. So you can also do it by adding the colors together and then add in the white after. That might be the quickest way. But you can see what's happening to the color here, how that richy brown, rich color that I had has gone more to a grayish brown. It's not a red brown anymore. It's not a sienna brown anymore. It's more like an umber almost. So you can see how that is happening. And if I pale that again, even more, let's pale it right down and let's cool it. So generally coolness and lightness, desaturation tend to create some sense of the distance. So we're going on here, maybe cool that a wee bit more, actually blue that, just so you can see that. We can lean it nearly over into the blues if we wanted to, so that the color we have is bluer than it is brown, if you know what I mean. So you can see that going on. And we'll put that as a strip. And you can sort of, I hope, imagine that there's something going on behind this one and certainly behind that one. And then perhaps you might have the sky or something here, but so I'm just using up the white and mixing in, so we'll get a very pale thing there. But you can see this little sequence happening of how we create that space and distance, okay? So use those principles when you're out painting the landscape. Don't try the principles and don't get panicky over whether you're matching colors identically or not. Certainly at the beginning, just apply the principles to watch what happens and how you can create space with what you've got in front of you. Now here's a little bit of a reveal, or I don't know whether it's a confession or not, but we talk about adding complementary colors to other colors to desaturate, drain them out. That is probably nearly the most scientific way to do it, because there's all sorts of theories behind it. But if you have Payne's grey, or make up a grey, but I've put a little spot of Payne's grey here. It's a colour I use a little bit, but not too often. But you might find when you're out in the landscape and it's about speed, perhaps the weather's against you and whatever, you might find that this is a quick way to desaturate. So what I'm going to hopefully do is I'm going to get back to this green here that I had. Got a wee bit blue. I'll just mix that all up there. Look, this very nice, rich sort of green. And again, this time, just take a little speck of grey in there, Payne's grey. Maybe let's get us a little bit more there. We'll put a little patch of this on, look. so that you can make a comparison. So there's a green with not very much grey in it really. And now what I'll do is I'll be a bit more generous with the Payne's grey. As obviously what's happening is darkening it. Remember that. So we might say, oh no, it's gone a bit too dark, so let's lift it up a wee bit. And you can see what's happened there. Look, slight change. If I add a little bit more, it tends to be a coldish colour that you get, which is maybe not a bad thing, you know. But if we do that and go up there, hopefully you can see another slight difference. And really most of this is gone grey now, to be honest. I'm losing the green and moving more and more to what I would call grey. But there is still a green in there. It's amazing if you look at my palette how much I'm stirring in. Look at that. That looks very grey. But once we see it I'm going a bit crazy here, but who knows. Let's say a wee bit more white. Let's really, really lighten that up there. Yeah, you can see that. And when I put it on, there's just still a hint of greenness about that. So it's amazing how much it takes to remove a colour and desaturate it to the point where it's nearly lost. You can see there another batch of Payne's grey going in. So you can see the graduation and the sense of distance, you know, the fading back happening within the Payne's grey. So in a way, that's another option for you, especially if time is an issue. Now, one of the other things we haven't thought about is viewpoint. So the images you've just seen are primarily about looking out towards the distance, if you like, and generally speaking, the distance has been lighter and cooler and more desaturated. And some of those images showed images or trees rather, through which we're looking, and they're silhouetted against that light. So the light it's as if we were inside the forest or inside a space looking out to the light outside. But what if it's in reverse? What if you're in the outer light area looking into a dark forest or into a dark space? And what I'm going to do here is hopefully just bear with me, bring up this image. Okay, so you can see there, this is a very dark image, but it's an image where the viewer is looking in towards the dense forest or a darker area, if you like. So it's a different set of contrasts. The first thing you'll see is that the trees in general are lighter than the spaces in between, which is the reverse of the previous images we looked at. You'll also notice that when you do look into those spaces, any shadows and any branches and any things that are going on are very, very, not only quite dark, but the changes in the tone, the brightness of them is very, very subtle. So where we had our images of the trees dark, silhouetted, dark against light, we're now looking in reverse. And when we do that, the spaces in between aren't light but dark. And the contrast that we see in those is very, very subtle. So if I can maybe enlarge this, bring this up a little bit for you, let's have a look at that. Now you can see what I mean. We have here a lighter tree, a very much lighter tree there, obviously depending on where the light's coming from, but the trees are lightish shapes and the spaces in between are very dark. If you look at this space, for example, you'll see other trees there, but look at the difference between the very dark and the slightly lighter. It's just slightly lighter. So there's not a very high contrast going on in there simply because there isn't any light or there's very little light. Whereas as we come out here, the light increases, therefore we get more contrast, which is a general sort of rule anyway. So if you're on the day when you're looking at the landscape, looking into dark spaces, be aware of that also. It may be that you're just simply looking down a pathway or something towards a darker, shadowy area, or you might literally be looking into a dark, dense area of foliage and forest, and you can see there. So when it comes to mixing paints and mixing tones, obviously you're going to try to get very, very subtle changes here, whereas here against the lighter foreground trees, the changes will be more obvious, more lifelike, or more bright, if you like. Just stop this here now. So that's just something to be aware of. So what it brings me really to what I'm hoping that you will think about when you go out to the landscape. Two areas. One is looking out of a darker area into light, and one is being in a light area looking into a dark space. So that's something that we're going to focus on the actual day.
One of the things about working outdoors is a sense of urgency. So in other words, sometimes the weather conditions or the light conditions are against us, and we want to try and make our statements fairly quickly. And that's quite important, that say the obvious things first. So what I mean by that is, here, this is a little piece of watercolor paper. I'm looking at the image of the dark sort of forest, looking into the forest. And what I know is, the very first thing I know is it's dark. Generally speaking, the whole image is dark. So that's the first big statement I can make. I can talk about all the details later on, but generally speaking, this is a dark place. And I think that's important to get in your mind when you're looking at the world around you. Is this bright? Is this dark? Is this a place with high contrast? Is this a place that's full of subtleties? And try to make big statements quickly and first of all. So what I've got here, this paper is very, very slightly dampened. You can see where I've indicated very lightly the some of the tree trunks that are in the image, but I haven't overdrawn it. I've just indicated those key areas. But the very first thing I want to do is darken this with a wash. So what I'm going to do is simply apply a wash across the whole thing. And what I'm really saying here is that none of this picture is really, really, really white. So the minute I do this, at least I'm making that statement that it's a slightly off-white experience. So what I'm going to do is let that dry before I go any further. What I'm going to do now is split this into the, if you like, three obvious tones that I can see. Again, the reason behind this is we're outdoors. We want to make something statement fairly quickly. If suddenly, I don't know, it started to rain or it was impossible to do anything more, we would at least walk away with this information. So outdoors, unlike being in a studio, doesn't give us the luxury of building things bit by bit by bit. We need to try and find ways to make the important statements very quickly. So what I'm aware of immediately here is that this image has kind of three areas. Lower down here, there's a tonal area. This whole area, if you like, in between or in below the trees, okay, is sort of a mid-gray, let's call it that, down underneath this tree here. So this could be put in as a block. Again, there's lots of little wrinkles and darks and shadows, and I'm kind of doing that to some extent. I suppose you can see with my brush, I'm sort of trying to indicate there's an undergrowth and things. And this is the same reason that if suddenly I had to stop, at least I've something here reminding me that there was an activity here, if that makes sense, that it wasn't just a flat area. But in amongst all of this, we have one, if you like, block. I'm also aware then that between the trees there are quite strong tones there. So in here, and hopefully I can avoid touching the other thing again. In reality we might have a bit more time, but if I then say, okay, let's just split the thing into the spaces. So I'm saying that I believe that these spaces are really, really quite dark. So we'll get that indicated fairly quickly. And even if for some reason I had to stop now, at least on this left side, I've got a little set of notations telling me that's a certain tone, that's a different tone, and so on. So, you know, if I was busy trying to get the wrinkles and the fold and the textures in the bark of the tree and all the wee bits of moss and everything, that wouldn't give me the information that really I need. So that's the important thing. You can see what I'm doing, just filling in these spaces here. Okay, we're going to deal with these in due course. We can come down, and as I look at that, I'm aware again that there's sort of undergrowth and bits of things. So rather than having just a flat area, I can make a few marks to suggest the grasses and things that are growing up over these spaces and things like that. Okay, and I'm just going to put this space in as one big area here at the end. Sorry, I want that to be slightly deeper than that. Yeah. So I can indicate I'm leaning over a bit because of the camera here, so hopefully it doesn't block the view of what we're actually doing there. This area is a big tree at the front, which is dark, but not quite as dark as those spaces. So what I'm going to do is put that in there. There's a little sliver of light beside it, but that's a sort of a biggish tree there. And we'll just put that block in. So what we've got now, and there's a sort of, you can sort of see the bottom of that tree trunk nearly there. But what we've got is just a very simple series of stripes, basically, to begin with. And we could even let this dry and then work into the subtleties of what's going on in the trees, because we know the trees aren't as light as that, so we've got to bring them down. So what we'll do is we'll dry that so it makes it a little easier to get into these spaces. So what I know now is that these light areas where there are tree trunks are nowhere near as light as that, of course. So now what we can do with a fairly reasonable sort of dark wash, we could literally just take and put a transparency over the top of that. Okay, so you can see what's happening there. What I'm doing is just killing off the very, very light areas here. So I'm just putting that right over the top of that. Okay, you can see that. I'll just blend that a little bit more. And you can see that's what's happening is that, and we can put some of these bits of foliage and things in here at the bottom as well. But what we've done really is immediately pushed back these tree trunks, if you like. And what we can do, maybe it's a wee bit still a wee bit wet here, but we'll keep on working at it. You might be surprised here just how much we can apply over that. It might be better let this dry again and layer it in systematically, but you can see that those lines and those things below that what I had there are still in existence, if you like, those shadows. Now I'm tempted to work a little indication of some of the leaves and things on this, and I'm going to take a chance because I know what's going to happen is it's probably going to bleed, but I'm going to drop a little bit in here because there are areas of trees, obviously leaves I should say, going on in this here area. It's a dark area here, you can see patches. And remember what is it I'm trying to say about this thing? What I'm personally trying to say is it's about being aware of the depth of the shadows that are going on in this shadowy area here. I know you're getting a little bit of reflection at the minute up at the top, but hopefully when you see this dry, it won't be there. So just over the top of that wash that I did there, I'm just bouncing in this sort of bit of information. There's a wee bit there too, and so on. And maybe at this moment say, okay, we've said a little bit more now. What we've got is a note that tells us that this area is very, very dark. The tree trunks that we see are really quite dark, although they're just slightly lighter, or they're lighter than the background. So there might be adjustments to be made. But if we stopped there and that was all we were allowed to do, we would still have the information that would allow us to maybe take that and at a later stage start to make another painting. I, of course, as is my want, I'm getting a bit interested in the foreground here. While I've got this particular tone on my brush, I'm seeing little bits, of foliage and the shadow down here at the bottom and so on. So before I dry it, I'll just bang a little bit more information, just loosen this, stop this bottom section being just a totally flat, because there are bits of things going on in there, So I'll stop there, dry it, and then we'll take it from there. So this is dry now, fairly dry anyway. And what I want to point out is the fact that in a relatively short time, we have made this general statement. This hasn't taken very long to do, really. We put a wash over the whole thing to take off the pure white. Then we broke it into 2 or 3 areas, that lighter area, the darker area there. Then we split that into the dense stripes, and then we put some indication of foliage on it. And that all happened very quickly. So we have key information here. Of course, we don't have details about the twigs and the little flowers that might be growing, but we have an essential sense of the sort of light that might be there. And now we can look at this, look at our image in front of us when we're out there, and say, okay, what needs tweaked? What's gone too dark, what's gone too light, what needs to be adjusted. And we can maybe then begin to go that little bit stronger into things. So what I'm just doing, I'm just putting a little bit more paint out there. I'm just working with Payne's Grey, by the way, for this exercise. But what I can begin to do is I'm looking at the image and I'm thinking, okay, in here, in this space between these 2 lighter tree areas there, I'm seeing little bits of dots and things. So now I can, or I've decided that I do want to put in a little bit more information, particularly here in this dark area. Actually, it's kind of nice to work that in. And what I'm noticing as the shadows go down to the bottom of the trees, they are more intense, generally speaking. But here and there I can just see the shadows of something going on. We don't know what's going on. It could be branches, it could be something else. There are little patches of darker things going on in there, not everywhere in there. There's other bits that are lighter, so I'm going to leave those. A little bit of dark broken up areas here. So I'm basically breaking up the bigger spaces into slightly smaller tones, smaller areas there. I got that a wee bit too wet there, but we'll just work with this here. So in here again, I can see bits where there's something in the spaces between these gaps here, these areas there. And hopefully when you're out there on the day, you will find that maybe the weather is sympathetic enough, so you don't have to rush things. But as I say, in this country particularly, the weather isn't that kind, and that's another reason why we need to be bold and get the statement in quickly. There's a lot of people begin and they paint from the top and work their way down, and but they get to about that far and the heavens open, and they go home and they've no information about what's going on here at all. So that's one of the big problems. So you can see there, I've just dried the brush actually, so I'm actually mopping back bits of that so that some of that will be less less light, if you like, you know. And what I notice here is as I'm doing that and I'm getting some of these quite intense tones at the top, that I'm realizing the bottom is actually too light. You know, the whole image of this place is really quite a dark one. You know, I'm really, you know, looking into the shadowy, murky sort of forest here, you know. So what I'll do while that's in my head, and again, because of speed, say, okay, don't leave it. Go ahead and say, let's get some washes over this area here. Just block across that, you know, and say that is not as light as it was. There is a difference, but not as much. You know, this is lighter than that, but not by as much as it might have seemed to me when I first started this exercise, you know. So I'm just washing that over, and that whole block now you can see relates differently. And immediately the murkiness of the trees, the place is a wee bit better. This big tree here on our left, you know, I know there are bits of, and I'm going to hopefully not contradict myself here talking about detail, but I'm just putting a few remarks in here to suggest, because I do see a little bit of texture on the edge of this tree here, so I'm going to go ahead and do that and let that disappear up. And you can see they're very harsh, but what I'm doing is washing the brush, rinsing the brush, wiping it so it's just damp on my hand, and just very gently, you can see me wiping it back a wee bit more, just merging those hard lines that I put on, because they're not streaks like that. You can see how each little stripe is bleeding one into the other, and just tapping around the edges of those things to make them merge a wee bit and look less stripy. So we've got some feeling of that tree that's on the left hand side being a wee bit rougher because it's closer to us. And I do realize that in the middle here that there's two trees that are lighter. They are catching a little bit of light. So what I can do with those is I can mop those back. So this is clean water in this brush, and I'm just, again, ideally this should maybe be dry, so I'm being very rushy about it, but I'll put a little bit of water there, a little bit of water along this one here, not too much. Let that sit for a second or two. Clean the brush. Either use, sometimes you can use a little flat brush for this. I'll actually go and see while I'm speaking. Sorry about the fresh brush right out of the box is happening now. You can't see it, but it is. This a little angle brush for corners, but it's quite nice that if I can take and just very slowly remove that, I'll dry the brush even more, and just lift that out a little bit there. And again here, just take that out a wee bit, because there's just a couple of wee bits there in the middle that are catching sunlight or something like that, you know. I'm just wiping the brush as I go, and just very slowly mopping it up so don't damage the paper I'm using is okay paper. It's practice paper, you know, for these sorts of things, but if I rubbed it too much, I think it would damage it a wee bit. What I'm doing is I've got keeping that brush, and it's just damp. It's just very clean water, but damp. And if I'm, you know, just damp to the touch, if I'm careful, you can just see if I go in there and just with the damp brush, you can see my hand wiggling there. I don't know, hopefully wiggle, and lift that out, wipe the brush, and then just mop that back a little bit more so we're catching a little bit of light out of that one. And you can see that I'm beginning to get some indication. I think I've wiped too much from that one. Actually, I think that wasn't as light. So with a little wash, hopefully that's dry enough, you can put that in below another layer of paint there. So we're beginning to get a feeling, if you like, of the depth, the intensity of this. Just realized also that this area isn't as light either. So these are the things you start to notice. So I can Again, I think that's dry, so I can put a very gentle stain over the top of that one, push that one back, which I'm happier about, and these trees come out a wee bit. But now I'm getting some feeling of this place being slightly lighter trees, dark shadows in between, and this tree on the left, which again I think is too light. But we can, within these areas of darkness, we can put other little bits. With this little brush here still damp. If you look at that, if I just very gently lay that brush on there and rub that a wee bit, I could indicate, and this is where I'm getting extremely fiddly, you know, but this, we can have the luxury of this now. You see just a bit of light in there might suggest that we're seeing a branch way in the forest somewhere, but just catching the light somewhere in there, if we could walk right in to that space there. So we can then do similar things at the bottom. We could take, if we wanted, and say, okay, well, you know, I'm realizing that there's clumps of foliage on in this bottom area, so we can maybe put that in. We'll work these together just like we worked the tree. So in other words, when I'm putting them on, they look a bit dotty, for want of a better word. But if I put them in there, look, and there are a couple of little bits of something growing up, twigs or something growing up there with the edge of that brush there. Put them in, and then to stop it looking a bit set on, again, if you take the brush, rinse it and damp it. So I've wiped that with a rag. I don't know if you can see that, just damp. And this is, and just again, you can see it bleeding the edges away, so it's stopping it looking like hard lines. So, and I wipe the brush again, come back in. So I'm basically removing parts there of the harsh lines I put on in order to stop the whole thing looking too contrived, you know, a bit looser, if you like, you know. But this is the luxury bit, in the sense that this is the bit of the detail. This is about light and shade, and about the atmosphere. And hopefully with this little exercise, you can see that if you work the big areas in first and then work towards the small areas, you start to get some sense of a place and the atmosphere that's going on, and then you can work it up into the whatever detail you like. I mean, being the obsessive person that I am, you know, I'm looking at that now and thinking, oh yeah, you know, there's even more going on in terms of the foliage there. There's maybe even more broken marks. I'm using slightly bigger flat brush actually for this, and just tapping that around the front of the trees there to give those sort of overhang, you know. But look, I'll stop there. That hopefully gives you a way to think about the process of how to study light and shade, certainly in terms of the watercolors. So in the little watercolor illustration I did there, we talked about tone, and how that controlled the sense of space. So what I'm doing here, I'm going to use some acrylics, simply because they dry that a little bit quicker than oils, obviously. But I want to talk about this time the color, the significance of color in trying to create space. And what I'm going to do here is I've just drawn out a little series of shapes representing tree trunks and the spaces in between, a bit like the last illustration. But what I'm going to do in this case is the areas in between, I've made up a green, which is simply lemon yellow and ultramarine blue, which you can see is a fairly rich green. So I haven't done anything with it. It's this nice pure green, and I'm going to occupy these spaces with that green, simple blocks of color here. Okay, so what I'll do is on either side of the tree trunks will be this particular green here. And what I'll show you very quickly then is on the tree trunks themselves, what I'm going to do is also use I'm just rinsing the brush here, use a very, very pure color. And the pure color that I'm using is simply a burnt sienna, very obvious sort of brown for a tree. And I'm putting a little bit of white into it. I'm just trying to lift this little palette over. You can see what I'm doing. You can see there the burnt sienna, a little bit of white. You can see that okay. Because we were talked about the spaces being darker and so on. So what we've got here, just finished mixing this, okay. I'm going to apply that sort of tone there. So you can see it's a lighter tone than the green, of course. This may be a little bit wet, but I'll put that in there anyway. So just a little exercise really in color. I'll bring this on down actually, so this represents the ground, if you like. We'll keep that all the same color as what we're having to represent tree trunks. So what I'm going to do is complete this, and then we'll come back to it, and we'll play around with saturation and all of the things we can adjust. So what we've got here, if we have a look, I've just been playing around with my colors here, but if you look at this image, which is pretty dry now, the spaces in between are darker than the foreground spaces, or at least what we'll call the trees, okay? And yet we would think, well, if dark represents depth and light represents, things that are closer, you would think that that would be quite, and then yet in a way there's a flatness about this. Even though we have these darker tones, it doesn't quite have a sense of walking into a forest. It's all very flat. It's very almost like a poster, like a piece of graphic design. So we know that the things we can adjust to create space are tone. We looked at that in a little watercolor example earlier. We can also not only adjust the darkness and lightness, but the temperature and saturation. We've talked about this maybe before, but that's what I want to do here. Now, what I've done, bring this palette I've made over, hopefully you can see that. There's the green that I've been using for the gaps in between here. That's the color that I use for the tree trunks, we'll call them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add red to the green, and most of you, I hope, understand that desaturates. That will tend to nullify the green slightly. What you notice too is I put the two together, put this green there, and I put the red beside it, because I just want to check that they're not dissimilar in tone. The red is similar in brightness to the green that I've made up. It's maybe tiny bit lighter, but very little in it. So I don't need to add white to this red to bring it up to a brighter tone. So by good fortune, we can add that in. When we add that in, we will keep the same brightness, or near enough the same brightness, but we'll have changed in another way. What I'm going to show you now, if I scoop a little bit of that green over there, okay, just clean that brush. I'm being a bit lazy as always, but scoop a little bit of the red into the green, and you can see, I hope, the difference between that and this. Okay, so I'll add a little bit more there, so you can see what's happening here. Okay, so at the moment, that's all I want to do. I'm not going to change it in any other way, but you can see a difference between the greens. And what I'm going to do then, I'll just set that aside, so now you've at least seen that. And I'm going to put some of that in to the mix, into the spaces, if you like. So we'll put them over on this side here, so we'll maybe compare them. So I'll block in over the top of the green that I've got there this slightly desaturated color. So we've lost the yellowiness, if you like, of the green, or the mintiness of the green here on this side. If we block that in, you can see even already, if we consider that to this, you can see a change in saturation and a change in depth, because the richness of the color is not jumping out and looking for my attention, and therefore it's going back, it's calming itself down. Here the color, because it is more saturated, and that's dried. Actually, you can see that, like most acrylics, is quite transparent, but if I put another layer on here, you can see, just layer that up so we can get rid of some of the wrinkles. You can see there the color, that color is more dominant. It's a pure color and it's looking for attention. It tends to want to come forward. This is happier to sit back a wee bit. It is slightly darker than the other ones, but not very much, you know. So that's the change that happens the minute we simply do one thing. So if we're trying to create space and we want a quick way of expressing that, then make sure you observe the fact that the colors back in here are most likely desaturated. So we'll come back to this in a second and have a look at some other changes. Now, in terms of space, what I've just done there in fact I paused the video, was to cover the rest of the greens with the desaturated green. So now if we look at the reddish browns, the light reddish browns that we've got in the trunks, as it were, and let's say we want to split those from the foreground ground. So we want to create a sense that these are not on the same level as this. What we could do is desaturate slightly this particular reddish brown color. So again, reddish brown is not the same as red, I know, but if I take this brown here and use the green, this is the very original green over here that I used at the very beginning, and because there's red in there, I'm leaning towards green. Green's a complementary of red. Even though it's a reddish brown, I'm going to put a little bit of green into it and just see how that will take the edge off. And I'm going to scoop a little bit more in there, you can see. So you'll see that this brown is becoming different to the browns that we were using, or I was using at the very beginning. It's gone a little bit darker, so what I'm going to do, just going to set that on there, hopefully that's going to be okay. I'm going to take that, clean the brush up. I'm using the brush as a palette knife, which is not great, but I'm going to bring that up now to a bit closer to the brightness of what I had originally, and you can see now the difference between that original brown and this brown. Even though they're similar in brightness, they're not the same in saturation. I have used green just to take the edge. I'm actually going to use a little bit more just to take the edge off that brown again. And it hasn't gone green, it's just a different type of brown. But if I keep adding green, it will obviously go greener. And I'll put a wee bit of white. So I want this color to be similar in brightness, if not the same to the one I used, but different in saturation. It's a muddier version of that. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll apply that on over the top of what we've already got. Okay, so I'm gonna take that, you can see, just takes the edge off the redness of the brown. You see the difference between that and that. I'm not going to put it down here because I want that to stay. I would like that to stay the way it is. So that drained out color is going on to these bits here, and just fill that one in. And it's not a massive difference in terms of brightness, because that's the whole idea, that we can retain the brightness if we want it, but change the nature of the brown. And you can see a difference between that and this. What I'll do is I'll just continue that over there. And what you get already simply by the change in those two is that this is richer and redder and tends to feel a little bit closer to that. And that in turn feels a little bit closer to this, because it's a bit warmer and certainly lighter. So we're playing with tone, saturation, temperature to create depth. So if you remember the very first image, it felt like a flat piece of graphic design. So I'm going to pause the video again, and then we're going to look at temperature. What I want to do now is change the temperature of this to watch what happens. So we know desaturation pushes back. Temperature tends to push back as well. In other words, cooler temperatures tend to go backwards, warmer tend to advance. So what I've got here in this little palette here is some blue and red acrylic paint. It's thinned, but very, very slightly. This can be done with oils also, but obviously oils take longer to dry to this stage, so you can put layers on top. So maybe if you're outdoors, sometimes there is an advantage of using acrylics when you're making studies. But you can see here the dilution of this, as I say, it's not it's thin but not too thin, watery if you like. And what I'm going to do here is set that down. I'm just going to place this over the top like a wash, like a glaze, which is what it is, over the top of this area here. Okay, I'm just doing it in that couple of sections to let you see. And it is fairly dilute, and yet you can, I hope, see the slight difference that's happening between this one and this one. Now it's getting darker because the blue is a darker color, and certainly getting the sense of depth going on there. What I can do is then, put the same wash glaze over each of these spaces. But again, I could, I suppose, if I wished, and this will dry back in and become a bluer green, a colder green, but it already is desaturated also. But I could, even if I wanted, say, okay, well, we'll not put it everywhere. If you look there, I'm putting the temperature a bit cooler at the bottom, a few wee patches in there, and that is what can give me this sense of shadows and light going on in between in the spaces that I'm looking into. We'll work across to this one here. So let's say that's colder down at the bottom. But as we get to the top, maybe there's a few, say, bits of foliage or something. So it gives a clue that there's maybe something going on in there, and it's not just a completely flat space. And you can see the atmosphere of a darker forest beginning to happen. Now, while we're at it, what we'll do is we'll move to the red. Sorry about that noise you're hearing, but it's me rinsing out brushes. If I take the red here, which is a crimson red, fairly strong red, again diluted, and this will make quite a difference, I think, to this front area, but I'm just going to do it anyway. As I said, it's quite dilute, but if I rub that over this front area, it becomes quite red. But what we want to see is the fact that the temperature has influenced that brown underneath, made a much redder color, and now that tends to throw itself forward. This is somewhere still maybe in between. This is much, much deeper. And we can keep on pursuing that idea of light and shade to create space. And what I'm going to do, I haven't used white really here, but just as a matter of interest now, the trees themselves, these trunks are still very flat. So if we just simply took and started to adjust those, so I'm making a lighter version, I'm adding white to the brown that I have here. So I'm going to create a little bit of lighter tone on the sides of these here. A wee bit more light there. So we're using the tonal variation. Make different shapes here to start making these trees look more tree-like and less like flat cardboard cutouts. So we can put that in there. And what I'll do, we talked about temperature there, that brown that I made up earlier, what I'm going to do, here it is, this is the brown here that I made up. I'm going to add a little bit of blue to that. So I'm going to make a colder version. So it was already desaturated. You can see what happens there when the blue goes in. It goes very grey indeed because it's colder. So now if we put that, let's say, on what we would call the shadow side of a tree, pretend that there's light catch coming from the right hand side. So we're actually getting rid of the original reddish brown, but you can see there that this is given some sense of light and shade in these things here, and also of temperature and also saturation and so on. The red in the foreground maybe is a wee bit harsh, mind you, but we can sort that out as well. We can maybe take the red that we put on, desaturate it with a wee bit of green and a little bit of white in that. I'll show you this in a minute, what we're going to get. So that's red, tiny bit of green, and some white. So you can see that slightly pink here, but not as harsh. And break this up. And as we break up and make variations of tone, we create surface. This is where surface, the illusions of lumps and bumps come in. Because that's another variety of space, if you like. You know, space is very shallow. And you can see now that these are glowing a wee bit more. The space in between is pushing back a little bit more. And we can keep doing that. What I want to do just to finish with is, if we pause this again when it's dry, what happens if we put entire glazes over it all and watch how it changes the illusion of depth. Okay, now what I'm going to do here, I've just dried this. Okay, again with acrylic, it's good because it's capable of drying very quickly and allowing us to do these glazes, and to some extent watercolor can do that as well. Oils maybe not so, but you can take your studies back home, let them dry and do this. And I would urge you to think about this. It's a very bold step, but just to let you see how if we change the entire tone of an image, what happens. So in other words, what we've got here is, fairly light tree trunk image with darker, cooler, desaturated gaps and spaces and so on. What I've got here below that, hopefully you can see, is a mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna, which makes a very mucky sort of grey, really. It depends on how much of each you add. And what I'm going to do is use this to neutralize everything in this picture and just see what happens. So I am actually going to put an entire glaze of this over the whole thing, and it will look a little messy to begin with, or maybe even afterwards, but and I'm putting it over everything, not just one section here. And you can see maybe already what's happening, that all of the colors are being put beneath this one unifying color. This color is pulling everything together in the sense that they're all getting a wee bit off it put onto them, and that'll look a bit streaky. It usually dries out okay, but even if it doesn't, as part of the process, it's important to see this. So if you look at that now, I've brought that way down compared to what it was. And again, with acrylics, it's deceptive, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to put more of this. I'm really, to be honest, pushing these boundaries really quite hard to let you see how paint can go a long way before you feel that it's gone. You can be much more courageous with the way you paint things. You can see them maybe there. There's the two colors, the sienna and the brown, going in together, and it's pretty thick, this. Now I know that acrylic paint is very transparent, which is why I'm doing this. You see there's not much, or there's no water going into this, okay, because I know that it is so transparent. And I'm going to put this over, I'll put it over part of it, as I say. It may be so you can compare these two things here. So I'm going to rub that all the way across this here as evenly as I can, and you can just see the slightly out of focus thing coming through there. As I say, I put this on before I let the other one dry, so it's a wee bit scratchy, but hopefully we'll just stop there. Look at the depth and the shadows in there, that you really sort of have to look hard to see the light of the thing. You have to squint, and that's very often the experience when you're in a forest looking out. It takes a while to realize, oh, there's a bit of light there, Look at this. It's right up in your face. It's a different experience altogether. And maybe, I don't know if this will work or not, but I'm going to do it anyway. A little bit of tissue here, to wipe out bits there, You can suggest that in those shadows there are maybe little bits of I'm just making imprints here, look, maybe wee bits of leaves and all, but they're not out in the light, they're in behind, And all of this was the result of managing and adjusting light and shade, tone, saturation, draining out the color or not, and temperature. Cold, desaturated; warm, slightly more saturated; more sense of atmosphere and space; less sense of that.
Hopefully, what you've just seen will give you some encouragement as to how you go about looking at the landscape when you're outdoors. This is all about light and space and atmosphere, okay? So basically be aware of what you're seeing. Secondly, put down what you see boldly and in broad strokes, literally, to begin with. Do not get seduced by grass and tree leaves and flowers and things. It's about light and shade. Is it a big open space? Are you looking out from the inside of an enclosed space like a forest, if you like, out to an open space, or is it the other way around? Are you out in the brightness looking towards trees which are in shadow? And how do you cope with that? How do you make that go down in terms of paint? And in terms of paint, what you do is be aware of tone, light and shade. Get those down as soon as you possibly can. Where is the biggest obvious light area, dark area, middle area? Block those in. Secondly, what about the temperatures? Are the colors warm or cold? Are they, leaning towards one way or another? And thirdly, saturation. Are they grey, almost mopped right out? Or are they very severe and rich? And where are those different colors? And again, put them down boldly in blocks. Don't try to paint a picture of a tree or a picture of a field. That will inhibit your learning. And this is what it's about. You're learning in these outdoor sessions. Put down a notation of what you see. And it might just be little blocks, doesn't matter. What you've just seen there in my little demos, that's what I was doing. You can see that I was blocking in what I saw and pulling it all together. If you keep those things in mind, you'll come away with a lot of information which you can use then either in paintings in the future, but hopefully you'll remember it okay. So look forward to seeing you out in the landscape and doing these things.